Hi, welcome to Rebel Therapy Podcast. I'm Katie.
And I'm Michelle.
And today we want to talk about what it's like to be living in this moment and how we balance, quite frankly, the challenges of this particular time with getting through, like whatever that looks like. So from a therapist perspective, obviously, we could look at that as self-support, but really, I think it's just, how do you live in the world and also stay intact, perhaps? Does that resonate with you, Michelle?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you're kind of confronted with a lot of devastating things on a daily basis, right? And like, how do you take that in without hardening yourself
Hmm.
or without it completely overwhelming you or, yeah, like really sticking you in despair where you're like, I can't do anything and there's no point in doing anything.
Yeah, that's what came up for me when you were talking, this idea of like, you don't want to I agree with you. I don't want to harden myself, but how do I not do that and also not sort of give in to despair or fall into despair,
Yeah.
perhaps, right? So it's that balance between, apathy and
Hmm.
nihilism and overwhelm. And I absolutely understand when when I work a lot with teenagers, this comes up all the time. And we'll talk about it. And I mean, I get it. I get how apathy is potentially an answer, right? It's an option.
Yeah.
It's an alternative to what is happening day to day. Imagine being 18 or 19 and looking at the world in front of you going, okay.
Well,
Yeah,
it's a survival strategy.
absolutely. Yeah. And so we sort of explore that. And so you and I were talking before, recording this podcast about how do we honor those feelings of despair, overwhelm, all the rest of it, but also then make a plan for living, right? Because if you don't ultimately choose nihilism, and like I said, most of the teenagers I talk to, we have a moment where we explore that and we sit with it, and it's like it's heavy in the room, right? And then invariably after a couple of minutes, it's like, okay, but now what? What's next? Right? Like, what are you going to do about it? Right? Does that make sense?
Yeah, like you go from a place of feeling paralyzed,
Yeah.
right, to being like, what can I choose to focus on or what can I choose to do?
Yeah. What can I do? Because social media is huge, obviously, for everybody. And hopefully everybody's getting their news from various different places and trying to cobble together what the truth looks like. But either way, it is generally overwhelming. And I'll speak for myself, over the last quite a while now, I guess. I'm trying to strike a balance between being a responsible global citizen and staying informed as to what is happening in the world without tipping over into, to your point, this sort of paralysis of despair. Because as one person, as privileged as I am living in this free country, actually, of Canada, where, things are actually comparatively still okay. I feel like that's problematic, but you get my point, right? I guess. But
Comparatively.
yeah, certainly comparatively. I'm coming from a place where I have a safe place to live and I have food to eat. And I mean, really, safety is the biggest thing, right? And yet, if I'm paying attention to what's happening in the world, it is overwhelming. And I do feel like tipping into despair. So, how do we strike that balance, right? For me, it doesn't feel comfortable. I don't feel okay just like backing away from it altogether. But then it's like finding that balance. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's like engaging with it on terms you can deal with, like the sources you're looking at, the amount of time you spend doing it. Like, I know for me, it's like I try to pay attention to like the felt sense in my body, and
Yeah.
it's like there's almost like I can feel like it just like starts to reach capacity where I'm
Yep.
like, I can't even take in anymore, really. Like, or like the level of just like horror of things that I'm seeing, or feeling,
The
right?
scale. The scale of it.
Yeah. And like it feels like it gets to a point where it can feel overwhelming. And then that's when I need to take kind of a step away and, yeah, like you said, be able to focus on something in my immediate control or in my immediate environment.
Okay, yeah. So that sort of brings us to a point that we were talking about earlier. You know, I think a way to maybe talk about that, or a way that I have talked about that in the past, is to call it like a zooming in. right? So to your point, if you go to a place where you have some control or some autonomy. So for
Mm.
me, it's like you zoom in to something that is more local, that is more specific, that is more personal. And it's not about abdicating your responsibility on the greater stage, like world stage. I'm not saying that. But what change can I affect? I can see what needs to happen, I believe. I can see the pain and the suffering and the horror and all the rest of it, right? So given all of that, how do I then sort of like crystallize my ability to make change in really specific areas? I don't know. Does that make sense?
Yeah, like, well, give me an example of like what would be something that you would zoom into in that
So, I mean,
context.
okay, so, and we talked about this earlier. For me, gratitude is one of those things. So, I mean, the idea that I talk to clients about this all the time, this idea that there's a misunderstanding that gratitude and happiness are meant to coexist. So you can sit around, I can sit around and think about all of the wonderful things that I have, like how lucky I am and my gratitude for the aspects of my life, right? And I think
Yeah.
that's really valuable. It doesn't necessarily mean that I have to be happy about it, though. I think what's true is that I can feel sad or despondent or frustrated or angry or whatever, and also feel grateful. And so it's this like the fact that those two things can kind of exist at the same time seems very important. So I'm overwhelmed with what's happening in the world. I take a step back and go, okay, but what can I be grateful about? I can be grateful for the fact that I'm sitting in my safe, warm house, right? And I'm intact. I have people that I love who love me. Like these things matter, I think. And it's not that they override the frustration or the fear or the anger or whatever about the world that I'm experiencing on the whole. It's just that they help balance out my experience of it.
Yeah. Yeah, like and you're reminding me of just something you talk about in therapy a lot where it's like the
Yeah.
ability to hold like two truths at the same time that feel like they maybe can't coexist, but oftentimes
Like,
they do in human experience, right? So like you're talking about, yeah, like despair and gratitude, right? And like
right.
um you're allowing like both to be there without them like canceling each other out somehow. And like
Yeah.
when I think about, as I was kind of describing that feeling of like overwhelm, oftentimes my zoom in is like, okay, take a deep breath, like attunement to my body of like, yeah, I'm breathing really shallowly as I am reading all these things and I'm feeling like, oh my God.
Because you're in a place of fear, probably, and anger, perhaps, and certainly a heightened arousal, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, no, I love that. I think that makes a lot of sense, actually.
And then
Um,
that allows me to be like, okay, and now I'm gonna go eat breakfast or whatever. Like then I can shift a little bit.
Yes, I think the other thing that it does, and I talk to clients about this all the time, is that it doesn't necessarily change your experience, but the act of breathing in means that you pause and you interrupt that process, whether it's despondency or anxiety or worry or whatever is happening in your brain, right? Going back to your body in that moment interrupts that process and gives you at least momentary relief, but it also lets you kind of reset and ground differently so that you have more resources with which to deal with the bullshit that is still there. So taking a breath is not going to change the world, but it is going to change your ability to respond to the world, perhaps.
Because you have to feel like you have some resources to give, right? Like if the support doesn't start within yourself, it's very hard to support other people and things.
So back to the old self-support oxygen mask in the plane, put your own mask on first before you try to help other people, which interestingly sounded so counterintuitive to me when I heard that first, but anyway, that's
Mm.
another story. But yeah, no, it's great. And I do think it's very relevant. I talk to a lot of young people who are overwhelmed by just how helpless they feel. That makes sense, obviously. But if you can, again, kind of zoom out to yourself or zoom in, zoom out, it's kind of the same, interestingly. But the idea is like, what do I have agency and control over? And from there, if I can support myself, what change can I actually make in the world? And I think it makes it a lot easier to affect change in the world if you have support for yourself.
And I think like that ability to shift focus
Yeah.
from like outside to inside and
Yeah.
to kind of like inner resource
Yeah.
allows you to feel like even a little bit of agency, right?
Yeah.
Where you're like, oh, I have some control over taking this next breath in a different way, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
then where are my other choices, you know? It like opens up that space to feel that question, to feel that difference.
Exactly. And I think that from that place of remembering your choices, then it's about finding meaning.
Mm,
And the type of therapy that we do, right? This sort of Gestalt perspective is like if there's no sort of inherent meaning to things, then it gives us the opportunity to create meaning for ourselves, or at least choose the meaning that makes sense. And I do think that that's kind of an essential aspect of like the zooming in. Okay, what can I do? I can't do everything. I can't change everything. I only have a certain amount of control. But if I can find the thing that I do differently, more uniquely, maybe my thing, if I can find what that is perhaps the way that I can impact change, affect change in the world. Yeah. And I think
yeah.
that that the resulting sense of autonomy and purpose that comes with that goes a long way to sort of
I think like meaning is a bit of an antidote to despair, right? Because despair is basically saying
purpose.
like,
Yeah.
what's the
Yeah.
point? Like anything I do doesn't matter. What, you know what I
Yeah.
mean, right?
Yeah. 100%. 100%.
But then to be like, oh, you know, like I can, yeah, I can be of service in some way, right? In the
Right.
way that I have my strengths that I can give to others, right? Or give to the world in some way. And allowing that to matter to you, right?
Yes.
Like to matter to other
Yeah.
people, but to matter to you, right? Like
First.
that's what
Got
keeps
to
you
matter to you
showing
first.
up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
from there, we change the world.
Sure. Yes. So easy.
No, but I think it does matter. Yeah. Okay.
No, it does. Yeah, yeah, I think almost what we're talking about is that shift of focus. Like there's a shift from overwhelm and despair to maybe gratitude or agency.
And some action, potentially, right?
Yeah, mobilization into action.
Love it.
Yeah.
Okay.